So, welcome to episode 4 of Shifting the Needle. This is our podcast for diversity and inclusion professionals who are interested in creating a sustainable and equitable future. Now, I am delighted today to have Jennifer Petriglieri, if I got that right, Jennifer, perfect, with me to discuss her wonderful book, which is called Couples That Work. I've got it right here in front of me, that she's written. And this struck me so strongly when I first, in fact, I was introduced to the book by one of our coaches, Melanie Green in South Africa. So Melanie contacted me to say that she'd got this book and it was fantastic and I would love it. And she was absolutely right. I do love it. Because Jennifer, what we do at Executive Coaching Consultancy is we specialise in parental transition coaching. And so this was such a useful model that I have to say, I think I've been spreading your book wide and far with all particularly the managers that I coach that are managing couples, that are managing, obviously, usually women that are going through the transition. So it's the most obvious people that we coach. And I recommend this book a lot because I've recognized how much the setup and the couple that they're in influences the way they manage and view the women that work for them that go off on parental leave.
Absolutely. You couldn't be more right. And in fact, there's some really interesting research on this that looks at who are the best managers for women in terms of diversity. And we see that they are, when we're talking about male managers, we see that they're men with working wives because they understand, right? And it's really hard to understand being in a working couple unless you're in one. Or they're men who have daughters who work, and so they can see the lens through that way. Because I think from the outside, we look at working couples and we assume this is just a logistical problem, right? If they can just get the childcare right, we'll be fine. But of course, there's so much more to it than that. And it's hard to understand that unless you're on the inside of one, or you really make an effort to try and understand what that feels like and the issues we're wrestling with.
Completely. So tell me, what was the inspiration for the book? And tell me, it's terrible to admit this, but I have been curious about the peas and the pod. What's the metaphor? I'm clearly stupid, but what is the metaphor?
Oh, the metaphor, 2 peas in a pod.
Well, it is 2 peas in a pod.
It's 2 peas in a pod. And I have to say, it's not my inspiration. My wonderful editor at Penguin thought of it. It's just genius. And it's a really good metaphor for working couples because the ways it can go right and the ways it can go wrong. Because I think very often when we talk about working couples, we talk about them in quite a conflictual way, right? There's trade-offs and we need to make sacrifices and all this kind of difficult things as if the 2 partners are almost working in opposition. And what I found in my research is, yes, that can happen, but we can also get into self-fulfilling, reinforcing positive cycles. And I think the 2 peas in a pod is when we're in that mode of working, then we really become 2 peas in a pod and they're sort of reinforcing each other. And the question, of course, for everyone is how do we get to that mode rather than this sort of working against each other mode?
Now, one of the peas doesn't look quite as round as the other.
It's been on a diet.
No, I just wondered if that was a comment about the gender diversity within no, okay, so I'm just
pure design. But also the book also features couples who are same-sex couples as well. So just to it's not all heterosexual couples in the book.
Very important because we do indeed coach a lot of couples that don't conform to that heteronormative norm. And I think it's really important to be more inclusive about that. And also a significant number of sole parents as well, women that decide to go alone. And so I think, is there something in here for them at all? Or is this...
I mean, the book really does focus on couples as the issue, but I think the lessons from that really apply to couples with one breadwinner and one homemaker, and also, sole parents and people really trying to juggle. It's really a question of what do we want out of life? Do we just want to work, or do we want work and love, and both of these components equally? And for people who want both, which I would say is the vast majority of us now, this is who the book is for. Yeah.
Do you want to just outline because I loved it. It never occurred to me that there are these 3 models of dual career couples. And that was really helpful for me. So would you like to just explain?
Yeah. So this comes back a little bit to what we were saying. It's not just about the logistics. And when we sort of scratch the surface a little bit of dual career couples, what we see is a key question for all couples is, how do we relatively prioritize our careers? Right? We've got to make some tough choices, and how do we do that? And there seems to be three sort of dominant models. The first is what we might think of as the traditional model, which is primary, secondary. And certainly if our parents were working couples, and certainly our grandparents, they would have had this, and it would have probably been our father and grandfather in the primary position. That's no longer the case. The gender dynamics are obviously more fluid now. But essentially what it means is both people have careers, both partners have careers, but one just takes the lead. So maybe if there's a geographical move, that person would lead it. Right. That person would do more work travel, their work would have more priority. And the secondary career person would still have a full career, but they take up more of the slack at home. And this is a model that can work quite well, but obviously it needs to match your home model, right? Your parenting model and things like this. This is the more traditional model. A second model is turn taking, which essentially means at any one time we're primary, secondary, but we take turns to swap positions. And this is actually a great model, because what we've seen in the last 20 years is an equalization of ambition. So men and women are equally ambitious at work, which we recognize. The piece of equalization of ambition that we don't very often talk about is that that's also equalized in the home life. So if we look back 20, 30 years ago, very few men would claim that they were ambitious to invest in children, to invest in the home, but that's changing now. When we look at the younger generations, the men want a piece of the action at home, right? So the great thing about turn taking is we both get a shot at investing in both domains. And then the third model is double primary. Now, this means we're both investing heavily in our careers. How do we do that? We do that because we've placed some boundaries in place. So let's imagine, for example, we place a geographic boundary. We're not going to leave London. So that takes some of the difficult decisions off the table. But within that, we're both going to go sort of full pelt on our career. And what's important here, of course, is the support structure around us to enable us to do that. Mm-hmm. And what I find in the research very clearly is that couples who thrive are ones who are very clear about which of these models they are. So they've really clearly negotiated it. They've agreed it, not just negotiated it. And they revisit it every so often. Is it still working for us? Is it time to swap positions? Is it time perhaps to transition models, given where we are in the lifestyle? And couples who really make that very conscious, of course, we all face challenges, but they tend to have a smoother ride than couples who don't negotiate that.
Yeah. And I think, Jennifer, I'm right in saying you're both professors together. So you are, in fact, a dual career couple, and you've got a son and a daughter. How old are they?
Yeah. So they are getting older by the day. 11 and 12, almost 13, I'm told every day.
11 and 12, a boy and a girl. Yeah. And I have two, but I am now an empty nester, Jennifer. So, but Mike and I are also in a dual career couple. We both very madly decided to run our own companies. So, took the plunge early. Yeah. And in fact, I'm sitting in my reclaimed bedroom my reclaimed room. This was Cameron's bedroom. So I'm an empty nester now. And so I'm going to start a campaign, Jennifer, which is reclaim the rooms.
I'm not quite there yet. We're still fighting for office space.
No, my house was full for 10 years of marauding teenage boys mainly, and girls prior to that. And so now I'm just enjoying that phase where, in fact, because nowadays, dual career couples, when you've got your children, I think somewhere it said something like you've got 20 years of that, 24 maybe. Yeah. Boomerang kids, etc. But actually, it's quite a small part of your overall life because we work for much longer. And that's what I'm very concerned about, is that when women sleepwalk into that primary, secondary, that first one, the traditional one, I get really concerned that often that isn't a discussion, and that women sort of find themselves in that position. Is that what you found from?
It totally aligns with my research. And I think whereas in the past, what women might sleepwalk into is giving up their career. Of course, that still happens now. And for some people, that's the choice they want to make, which is fine. But what's happening more and more now is the sleepwalking into primary, secondary. And that happens for a number of reasons. One is it may make sense at the beginning, but then we don't revisit it and we just sort of carry on. Another might be financial pressures. We know there's a gender wage gap. And, you know, as families, money is important. And, you know, we make decisions based on that. Perhaps we place a little bit too much weight on that, but that can change things. And what very often happens to women when, you know, they get to my stage in their mid-40s, or a little bit later when their children are starting to, you know, my children are teenaging now, they don't need me much anymore. And I think a lot of women wake up and realize, oh goodness, you know, suddenly 10, 15 years has passed. Did I make the right choice? And how do I ramp up again? Now, of course, it's easier to ramp up if we've at least kept a foot in the door, but it's still difficult to really accelerate through. So there's a question for all couples in how do we make sure we don't close too many doors for the future, given that period of real intensive child rearing. Of course, they're at home for 20 years, but it's really the first 10 years and probably the first 6 or 7, which are the real heavy time intensive child rearing. Then you get into the boyfriend girlfriend issues, right, which is more the emotional side
and the rest, Jennifer,
and the rest. So it's can we get out of that thinking just of that period and think a little bit more long term?
And I think one of the things that you mentioned there is the financial pressure. And one of the things that really struck me from your book was the fact that, and it was a really simple technique and observation, is that it's true that the women I coach, when they're talking about the family income, they divide it so that they talk about, well, my husband earns more, so it was obvious he should be the primary carer, the primary breadwinner, and so it was obvious that I should step back. And the thing that they then do is, having stepped back, because something like 50% of the women I coach now come back on a 4-day week. So by stepping back, what they then start to do is they equate their earnings to being what they earn minus the cost of childcare.
Yes.
And what is a tremendous tip from that book is don't look at it like that. Do you want to just expand on it?
I mean, I think there's two. I think we can break this into two. One is, you know, why do you do the job you do? It's not just for money. Of course, at the bottom line, we all work we need money. Let's not be naive. But why this job versus another job? It's for the community, it's for personal development, it's because you love the people, you feel a sense of growth. The problem when we start choosing on money is we ignore all that stuff, but that stuff's really important. You know, why are you less valued because you earn a little bit less? And maybe you find your job more meaningful, which at the end of the day means your job is actually much more valuable than your partner's, maybe, who hates it but is bringing in the money. So I think the first lesson is look at these decisions holistically, not just on how many thousand more do they earn than you and what's the differential, because we really make bad decisions that way. And then the second thing is, even if you don't have a joint bank account, of course, couples do this different ways. We've got to think of our money holistically when we start taking costs off. When we start thinking, well, my childcare is $15,000 a year, and if I take that off my salary, it's that. That's crazy. Why is it off your salary? Absolutely. And I think it really does ourselves a disservice. And I think there's many reasons women do this. You know, society really pushes us into us. But what I would say is there's very, very few couples I've come across where it's the man pushing this narrative on the woman. It's very often the couple just reacting to what the narratives of society are and what we should do. Absolutely. So I've never found a couple who haven't, when they look at this in a different light, felt uncomfortable about it and felt, well, actually, no, I do think the childcare should be counted in your wage. I've never come across a man or a partner who said that. I think we just naturally fall into this because it's the way it's always been done.
Personally, I think that's quite revolutionary, that thinking, and I've introduced it now to anyone that I coach is, you know, step one before, you know, when they're pregnant, is think about having a conversation about joint earnings, not about his career, your career. This is about what comes in. And part of it is because society doesn't pay for caring, but it doesn't mean you as a couple shouldn't build that in. It is actually unpaid work.
I would also say in today's world, it's very difficult to predict our future earnings from our current earnings. So in the past, it was fairly reliable that if you were on X amount by the time you were 30, that meant your career was going to go like this. That's no longer the case. And it's a very dangerous game financially to say, well, you earn more than me today, therefore you will always earn more than me. That just does not stack up with what we know about the employment market. So we need to be really careful not to dig ourselves a hole later on by making these wild assumptions, given what we're earning today.
And I think also, there's some recent research by the IFS, and it was saying, I think it's something like 38% of couples that are dual career couples, the woman is actually the primary earner, and yet they are 4 times more likely to leave their job.
Yeah.
So to fall out of the workforce. Now, that really points to the fact that it isn't money that's driving this, that there's something else going on, doesn't it?
Of course. Yeah, exactly. And we've seen that in the COVID pandemic, of course, when we've looked at who's doing the childcare, who's doing the homeschooling. Unfortunately, it's very much disproportionately falling on the women in almost every couple. Of course, we can all think of the rare example where that doesn't happen, but the vast, vast majority, that dynamic is still there.
Yeah, I think so. So what tips would you give to, let's talk about women who are thinking about becoming, having a baby?
Well, first, it's the most wonderful transition in the world, becoming a mother. So it's not all bad. It's not all bad. But I think we need to do so really mindfully vis-a-vis our career and think about what are our goals holistically. Of course, it's wonderful becoming a mother, but that's not the only piece of us. There are other pieces as well. And I think the real foundation is knowing what are the things I want out of life. Now, that can feel a really big question, but I always think, okay, think of the next 5 years, which is a really manageable time frame. It's long enough that some things can really shift, but it's not so long out. Like, I can't imagine myself at 65 now. It's just too far away. Like 20 years projecting is too far away. And think about, how do I balance those goals? And of course, if you have a partner, then how do you balance those goals together? And one of the things I found most clearly in my research, especially at that point where we're deciding or just on the cusp of becoming parents, is those parents to be who'd really mapped out, okay, what is it we want, were the ones that did the best. Now, of course, they didn't always get everything they wanted, but simply by bearing that in mind and sharing that, they felt supported in their goals. And of course, not everything we want comes true. Maybe it takes us 3 years to have a baby, expecting to come, we never know, do we? Yeah. But just that real baseline conversation, because very often what happens when a baby arrives is life turns a little crazy. And it's really easy to lose sight of each other in the couple and to lose sight of what we want from our careers. Now, this isn't an injunction to do everything at once and push, but it's about kind of not letting go of the things that matter to us, even if we decide to stagger them a little bit. So I think that would be my number one tip. My second thing is back to the finances. Do not make any decisions based just on finances. Of course, finance will always be in the mix unless you're incredibly wealthy, which very few of us are. But it needs to be in the mix as opposed to the only thing. And the third thing I would say is think about extended support networks. I think particularly in the UK today, we've really gone hard on this very nuclear model of parenting, which in the history of the world is very recent and just does not work very well. It takes a whole network to bring up a child and support people working. And if we look at those countries, for example, in the Middle East or in Southern Europe, where it's very normal for both parents to work, and yet the grandparents or the great aunts and people like this will chip in the childcare. This is traditionally how it's worked, where the people who are of good working age go out and earn the bread, and the people around them who are perhaps that bit older take care of the reins. I think we need to go back to a model like that if we really want to be working parents. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be our relatives, right? We may pay for that help or, support each other with friends networks, but we've got to get away from this real hardcore nuclear family sort of idea, or ideal, maybe I would say.
And I think it also it's an unfortunate collision of intensive parenting, where people only think it's their input that can work to bring up a child. I think there's much more nervousness about having other people look after your children, along with intensive, the intense work culture. So it's almost a collision of, the two things coming together, where to be the ideal employee and to be the ideal parent is really hard to achieve. And a lot of women, quite conscientious, try too hard
to do both. Yeah. And I think this is where the research can let us off the hook a bit in both sides. So first of all, let's look at the research on parenting. We know that intensive parenting model actually does not do good for our children, right? There's a lot of research now that shows that. And for two reasons. One is children who develop healthily emotionally have attachments to a wide range of adults. I mean, not hundreds, but a good 5 or 10 adults. And when it's just 1 or 2, that's not actually quite as healthy for the children. We know that. We also know that children who do well develop independence really early on. So they're left to play on their own for a bit, right? They're left to learn to get themselves dressed really, what we might think of now as a young age. There's no reason why a 2-year-old can't get themselves dressed unless it's a very fiddly something. And we know those children do better later in life. So it's actually better for our children that they have more adults and that we're more hands off. Also, from a productivity standpoint, there's amazing productivity research now that shows that more than about 40 to 45 hours a week, our productivity nosedives. And it's not just that it nosedives for the 47th, 48th, 49th hour. It has a back effect as well, such that our productivity out of those early hours in the week also decreases. And so we're not actually doing ourselves any favors at work. And there's a big body of research on this now that looks at kind of the importance of structured time off, the importance of this marginal flexibility. So not necessarily part-time work, but can I take a break in the day to really get some headspace, or run around the block or whatever it is. So there's very strong research from both angles, which shows that is not a sensible thing to do, either for our work or for our families.
I absolutely think that the culprit in one of the real reasons why we have so few women running things is that this culture of overwork. We've almost put work on a pedestal, and we haven't quite come to terms with the availability of the tech and how that's 24/7 availability. But human beings weren't designed, the brain is a muscle, it isn't designed to work 24/7. And actually, it really does have an ongoing debilitating effect on your ability to think. And nowadays, with smarter and smarter problems, with needing smarter and smarter people, because the problems are getting more complex and the computers can do all the simple stuff, what you actually need is a really on-it brain, and that brain isn't on it if you're 60, 70 hours a week.
Yeah, exactly.
One last question, Jennifer, because I could talk to you all day. One last question is, what about if you're already in that groove? Because, we've talked about before you go in, this is great to know this stuff, and I completely get that. But I also coach women that are much further down the line in their career, and they're in a pattern where they did sleepwalk into that. What advice would you give for them?
Yeah, it sometimes feels like I just need to carry on, right? And I think for all couples, all working women, whatever stage they're at, it's really important to have those kind of health check-ins, right? And I always say at least once a year, and definitely at every major transition. And when I mean a major transition, a new job, a promotion, see a baby if we're going to have a baby, or all these big life transitions. Just to have that check-in with ourselves, like, am I on the right path? Because what we very often find with women, particularly at my age, I'm 45 now, is that they wake up one morning and suddenly think, how did I get here? And is this really where I want to be? And I'm sure you'll know this from your coaching work. It's very often the women in their mid-40s who reach some kind of crisis point, right? Almost an existential crisis of identity. Is this what I want? And very often, first of all, those can be very helpful developmental moments. So it's not to say that's a terrible thing to be in. But very often it's bigger than it needs to be because we've not been checking in along the way. Yeah. So I think it's really important to check in with yourself. And obviously, if you're in a couple, to check in with your partner. And as your children get older, quite frankly, to also check in with them. I think, once kids reach 7 or 8, not that old, they can have pretty intelligent conversations about, mummy's career and what the impact that has. And, and you'll probably be surprised talking to your children, they'll probably be very proud, be quite excited about it, and C, have all sorts of ideas for things you could do that you would never have thought of. So I think it's about, we often make the assumption that I cannot change anything because it will impact the kids, it will impact my partner, it will impact my support network. But as we're developing, so are they. And very often the whole system gets themselves to a place which is not helpful. So it's about thinking, actually, by having these conversations with myself and others, I might actually be doing them a service as well as doing myself a service.
I think that always helps to position things for women in particular, to position it as being for other people, because the one thing, the self-care thing, is something that goes out the window. And yes, Mike and I have what we call relationship MOTs. And we read about it, would you believe, in a newspaper. It was some idea, and I gave you a little quiz, and you actually took it away. And you sit down and you say, and one of the things that it talked about, which was really lovely, was this idea of, it's not a relationship MOT where you go out and you talk about the things that are annoying you about the other person. It's actually about what we saw as our bucket list for family.
Yeah.
So, we both had on it that the children would graduate and that, they would do well, and thankfully both of them have, and they have done well. So, and some other things on it that were bucket list things. And we agreed on quite a few of them, but we wrote them separately and bring them together.
And I think that's really powerful, because what we find happens with couples, especially in their middle years, is they can really often lose sight of each other. And they lose sight of each other because life is really busy, right? You've got the kids, you've got the career, you've got your extended family. And if you can get through the day, keeping all those in mind, success, collapse into bed, wake up the next day and repeat. Okay. Well, long term is the recipe for disaster. And what I find in my research and what I talk about in the book is that what can really help couples is these joint couple projects, right? Where they have some joint goals. Now, some of those may be around the kids, some of them might be about volunteering, some of them might be about hobbies you want to do or lifestyle, but just having that sense of our couple is doing something together. We're not just being, but we are on a shared goal. Is really powerful. I
think that's a great place to end, with something very positive. So I shall drink to that.
Afternoon tea.
What we can do is, for those of our listeners, we have created a little quiz. It's a couples quiz. And it's just to get you to fill it out with your partner. And it works. We did one for people thinking about having children, and then we created it again for people that are in the dynamic now. And it's just, if you like, to structure round a coffee or maybe a drink, to structure this conversation, because I think it's important to bring it in with a light touch, and it not being something that's coming in as being an opportunity to have a go at each other. Jennifer, thank you very much indeed. I cannot recommend the book enough. So for all of you, those of you who are just listening and not looking, it's Couples That Work, How to Thrive in Love and Work by Jennifer Petriglieri. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you.